thank you everyone for joining us today and welcoming us into your offices and your living rooms and your homes and wherever you're tuning in from, maybe your car, for an hour of your time while we get to welcome and talk to the incredible Dr. Marc Sniukas. He is a strategic advisor to global CEOs, an author of The Art of Opportunity. He's a creator of, or the creator of the Better Strategy OS. He's got a uh, makebetterstrategy.com school. We're going to provide all of his information. He has over 20 years experience helping organizations like BMW and Deloitte and De Beers move beyond planning and really get into real strategy. He knows what it takes to drive alignment and clarity and measurable results. And that is exactly what project managers need to do. So we're super excited that we get to have him here today, and I'm going to hand it off to him to actually do his own introduction.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth. So yeah, thanks for having me. And I think you mentioned most of it already, right? So on the professional side, yeah. So I've been helping CEOs, leadership teams, um, all around the world, really. So I think I worked in most European countries, so working in North America, Latin America, South Africa, a lot in the Middle East, Asia, China. Yeah, help companies, help executives do strategy, do what we call better strategy. So design strategies and activate strategies, drive the change behind executing new strategies. On the personal side, I'm from Luxembourg originally. After having lived abroad for like 15 years in Europe, did my studies in Austria and the UK, and yeah, I've been back to Luxembourg now for some 12ish years here.
Perfect. Well, thank you. We're really happy to have you here on a Friday. I'm going to kickstart with a very, I guess we'll call it a fundamental question. Let's talk about what it is that strategy means and what is it that entails a strategic mindset.
Right. So if we talk about what strategy is, I think there is a lot of misconception and confusion around that. So many people think about strategy as having a plan, or thinking about strategy as something you do in the future. So you have that future vision, and I like to keep it very pragmatic and define strategy as solving strategic challenges. So if you think about what goes on in the mind of the strategist, so to say, and if you want to be a strategic thinker, it's really about solving challenges. Now, if I say challenges, it doesn't mean, well, I don't necessarily think about that as something negative or a challenge as a problem. If you think about how to seize an opportunity, that can also be a strategic challenge. But the key is really that challenge. So if you don't have a challenge, I often say you don't need a strategy, a plan will do.
Okay, so basically, strategy is a mechanism to solve complex problems. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, so we might want to discuss what that means, complex. But usually, so I mean, you have a goal, right? You have an ambition, you have an aspiration, and maybe you have a vision, or maybe you have a purpose, a mission, whatever it might be. So I talk about ambition, or I like to talk about ambition, because I learned a long time ago that every company has their own way of thinking about that future state they want to achieve, and some are more purpose driven, some want to create value for stakeholders. Other companies, they are just more looking at the financials. So that's why I talk about ambition. In fact, I mean, I remember a story where we were working with a group of companies as part of a division of a large global manufacturing company. And these guys, they wanted to work on their purpose. So we did that. So we worked on the purpose. And then eventually the president of the division went to the board, to the CEO, to present the purpose. And the CEO said, I don't really care about your purpose. Show me the money, more or less. Right. So, and that's when I learned kind of to focus on the ambition in whatever way the company kind of defines that. So that's the first part. So you need that ambition, right? And then you have constraints about how to achieve that. You have things that make it difficult to achieve that ambition. You might have opportunities, things that help you to achieve the ambition. And then strategy is really about how do you, some call it bust the bottleneck. Peter Combo, for example, talks about busting the bottleneck to achieve your ambition or just solve these problems or solve these challenges, seize these opportunities. And the way you do that, that's your strategy.
So that's a good point. I think we saw in the chat here from Alan Michaels the comment, why not limit to business strategy, then focus on corporate strategy versus business unit strategy? Now we have context. So if I layer that against what you were talking about, Mark, we have a difference between corporate strategy as well as business unit strategy, and then layering that into project management. Before I kind of let you answer that, I want to kind of layer that from Elizabeth and I's perspective. When it comes to project management strategy, you're looking at dependencies, upstream and downstream impacts, as well as the long-term, and the short-term horizons in order to realize intended business value. And then I'll hand it back off to you.
Well, I mean, the point you made about, particularly in project management, there's lots of constraints that need to be solved somehow. And I think, again, that is where the strategic mindset comes into play. How do you solve these constraints? Now, going back to Alan's comment, so I said strategy is about solving challenges. And I like that definition. And by the way, it's not my definition, right? So it's something, if you go to the literature, many people have talked about challenge-based strategy or issue-based strategy, or really that idea of strategy as solving challenges. Now, first of all, I think it's a good definition because it's universal. It always works. So no matter where you are in the company, if you align that, when we talk about strategy, we talk about how we solve challenges, that always works. No matter whether you're talking about corporate strategy, business strategy, cybersecurity strategy, HR, whatever it might be. Right? And it also works outside of business. You can apply it to your own career. You can apply it to the constraints or challenges you have as a project manager, for example. Now, beyond that, or if we take it a step further, so that's a generic definition, as I said. Now, obviously, in business, there is a set of what I call universal challenges that you need to solve. So if we talk about, and that's where these layers, we talk about layers of strategy, corporate strategy, business strategy, functional strategy, and above that, you might have something like network strategy, where these layers come into play. So depending on what kind of layer of strategy you're talking about, you have very specific challenges that you need to solve. So a classic challenge of network strategy is, where do you compete versus where do you collaborate? How do you manage these kind of collaborations? So if you look at airline alliances, it's a good example of network strategy, where you have a couple of airlines getting together and sharing resources, sharing activities, not sharing too many of the positioning, for example, but trying to cooperate in order to compete better against those who are not part of the alliance, let's say.
Okay, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I want to stop you there for a second. And E, correct me if I'm wrong. I want you to layer that experience, because he said shared resources. And I think that's important for as a program and project managers from that network strategy. Can you tie that together from the project management perspective?
Yeah. So if you think about it,
Okay.
network strategy is really about multiple companies coming together and aligning their strategies. Right? Then you have corporate strategy. Okay. So as a corporation, as a group of companies, you have to decide, what businesses do we want to be in? So the generic challenge to solve there is, what business do we want to be in? How do you want to manage these businesses? And usually there's a tension between, well, we want to manage businesses in a kind of unified way. So we're looking for synergies. So we're putting all the trying to get synergies, and by sharing resources, again, by sharing activities across the businesses. Or on the other hand, do you say, well, we leave the businesses as much freedom as possible, so that they can be more responsive maybe to what is working or what is happening in their environment. And so I have a client, for example, it's a 45,000 people organization, multiple business units. They have one sales and marketing organization for all the businesses. So that's a corporate level strategic decision. We're looking for synergies. We're putting all marketing and sales resources together, and we pool these activities. Right?
So, Mark, one of the things that comes to mind here is that some of these strategy layers are not within the project or program manager purview. They happen before they get involved, or they happen above them. And right. So one of the questions that comes in the chat, and it comes from Anna, is, I heard vision is the why and strategy is the how. Is that how you would generalize that particular statement? I know that it is more talking about strategy at an overarching level than rather we're at the program and project.
Right. So the the why is your ambition, what you want to achieve, and the how is then again how are you going to solve the challenges, right? And again, as I said earlier, if there is no challenge, then you probably don't need a strategy, but you need a plan. Right? Back to what you just mentioned, Justin, in terms of yes, so you have these layers again, as we said, so the network, the corporate, then business strategy, and functional strategy, and obviously whatever you decide on the layers down has to be aligned to what has been decided on the layers above, right? And if you have a corporate strategy, for example, where you say, well, we are looking for synergies, like the example that I just gave about this company that has centralized sales and marketing, obviously then you have to work within that, right? So you can't make your own decisions, but you have to work within that, right? Now, if on the corporate level you decide that you're going to give a lot of freedom to the businesses, obviously then you have less constraints on that business level, right? And then, so we have the business strategy, which is about how are we going to compete, and then we have the functional level strategy, about which is about how are we going to add value as a function to the overall business, right? And usually, then these challenges they kind of
Okay.
they should trickle down, right?
Yeah, this is
Right now,
about the part.
right now, working with a client where we have made business level decisions on strategy, and obviously then that needs to be translated into the functional levels, right? So, for example, we say, okay, we're going to develop a new product platform. Obviously, then product development has to work uh, within that context of here is the product platform that we want to do, right? That we want to develop or that we need to develop. Then on the product level decision, again, you have these constraints. You have the challenge. They don't have endless resources, so they needed to come up with a strategy on how they are going to manage to actually develop this new product platform, right? And the strategy there was to say, well, we don't have the resources to develop all these components that we would like to have on the platform our own. Right? So the strategy is that we're going to source the components from the markets, and we are going to focus our development on integrating these components. So you see how that logic of we need to solve the challenge that we have kind of trickles down into departments and functions and teams
Right.
and projects.
So when we get to the functional, this is where we would be looking at project managers or PMOs coming into play to help
Right.
execute that, right?
Yep.
So what I'd like to know then is we know that the project management kind of sits at the bottom of the levels of the strategy. So, one of the biggest issues that project managers face is how do they start contributing to that
Mm.
strategy? How do they, because, and I also want to talk about how initiatives get prioritized, but that's part of it. Can they contribute to that? So, how do we get that functional level, which is the lowest level? How do we start being able to elevate PMs across the layers to be
Yeah.
able to become more strategic
So I
partners?
think, I mean, if you are as a PM, if you are kind of involved in the decisions or the discussion around what should we prioritize or what kind of project should we drive or how should we drive a project, very often we have the management that might define here is an initiative that we need to do, and they might just say, so if we define on a, let's say on a business level, we define that we need a reorganization to be able to live the new strategy, right? My preferred approach is then to say, okay, we assemble a team, so we have a project manager who drives that initiative. So I would give them lots of freedom in terms of how to do it. Obviously, then as a PM, you need to understand the bigger picture. You need to understand the ambition. You need to understand the strategy so that with your reorganization, in this case, the initiative of the reorganization, you can actually make the best contribution and help execute that overall strategy. Right?
So there's a few things that we need to unpack here, and that comes in the different layers of project, program, and portfolio management. Portfolio management is where we're taking initiatives, we're putting them and we're prioritizing them based off of organizational goals and a vision, and then taking them down to the functional level. A perfect example would be digitizing a particular department or a function,
Yeah.
like implementing an ERP platform. And what I'd like to ask you here is how we would prioritize that from a portfolio management perspective. What types of metrics, KPIs, pieces of data do we need to think of? And then how does that cascade down to the project manager who needs to somehow have a fundamental understanding to demonstrate value towards that?
Mhm. So when we talk about, so in the context of strategy, for me, there's two types of prioritizations, let's say. The first one is you need to prioritize the challenges that you're working on. And the way I look at that is a challenge. What is the priority one when it comes to challenges? It's a challenge that impacts or it has the potential to impact the survival of the company, of the organization, of the business. So it's really business critical.
Okay.
That's one thing I look at. And the other thing I look at is the second dimension is it a challenge that impacts the entire organization or just a part of the organization?
Okay. So you're doing that analysis of, and I used to do this, I did this at a company a long time ago, of like, it's not just looking at like number of resources or like, one team that's massive, right? We have to look at the overall impact across, because if one organization is impacted, if others are impacted as well, that makes that magnitude of the risk so much higher. It makes that so much more business critical, which is why
So
we
I want to look
prioritize
at
that.
things that are really crucial for the survival of the organization, and I prioritize these things in terms of strategic challenges that need to be solved.
So let's talk about that for a second, because that's a pretty loaded sentence. Survival of the business. That can mean
Yeah, I was gonna highlight that too. I was like, that's like, I wanna emphasize that to everyone. I'm cutting you off just because I want to emphasize, because exactly where Justin's about to go is, we always talk about tie to business impact. That could be revenue, which is business critical. So I just, again, survival, like I love the way you put that, Mark. So I'm gonna give it back to Justin, but I was like, I have to highlight it for everyone, because like survival is such a strong word, and it's so
right. So there's the
accurate.
regulatory piece when it comes to the macroeconomic, where you have to be compliant. There is shifting market needs, and you need to become more relevant to your customer segments, or you're looking at scalability for your organization in the long run, or you're looking at an exit strategy if you're going to sell the company and you want to make it more attractive. There are different, can you expand a little bit more on these other components that come into play when you're looking at business survival?
Yeah, I mean, it's really about, so if you say we have a supply chain disruption, you could say, okay, that impacts potentially the survival of the organization. You might say it's only part, or initially at least it happens in a part of the organization, supply chain or purchasing, whatever, and then it might have an impact on the larger stuff. Like you mentioned, regulatory. So maybe if you're not compliant as a bank, for example, or a financial institution, then obviously that's going to put you out of business. So that is something that you might want to prioritize. Now, just last week we had I was in the Middle East, and we did an executive education program where we talked about prioritizing these challenges. And then so I give them 5 challenges in the banking context, and they say, okay, how do we prioritize them? Now, the thing to recognize, and the part of the exercise, is really the awareness around there might be no right or wrong answer to this. Right? So you talked about data and KPIs. Well, maybe there is no data or KPIs. Right? So again, if you want to prioritize these challenges, obviously you need to have that ambition. So you need to know what are we actually working towards. Right? But I think it was Richard Rummel who said that, or wrote about it in his books, that without knowing the ambition, you can't really know what is the challenge, and without knowing the challenge, you can't really know whether your strategy is any good or not, because you have nothing that you can kind of evaluate it against. Right? So the thing here is really, it's more about having the conversation and aligning on this is what we focus on. So we go back to how do we prioritize, right? It's more that alignment. So don't try to, I mean, if you have data, nice, but in most cases there won't be any data, right? So it's really more about having the conversation and aligning on this is really what we need to focus on and we need to work on.
I think
So I want to I want to say one thing on that really quick to tie it back to how that project manager becomes more strategic, and then I want to look at some of the comments. We've been getting a lot of questions before we kind of veer off. But to your point, our job as project and program managers is to drive alignment. And one of the ways we do that, right? One of the ways we move from functional up to, I guess, the business layer is when we're reporting, when we're driving alignment, when we're in meetings, if we can tie those discussions to those survival of the business. You said KPIs, but if If it's the revenue, how do we define the trade-offs, right? How do we drive that alignment to move decisions forward? So if we can say, look, you've got two different options, one is going to impact revenue this way, one is going to do it this way, that decision is going to happen a lot faster, right? Because you're now connecting it to, you're moving up to the business side of it, but you're still connecting it even to like the network and corporate layer of strategy.
Yeah.
Is that accurate? Is that fair to say?
So you're already, yeah, you're about to segue us from the high level into the granular pieces that get back to the project and program manager. But before we do that, Mark, there's one question from Cesar that I see that's more at that same level, which is, how do you validate whether a strategy is actually strategic versus just operational?
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit, very often we have these discussions around what is strategy and what is tactics, right?
Yeah.
So kind of two
love it.
Two thoughts here. So the first one is, I try not to get into that kind of discussion. Is it tactics, or is it strategy, or is it strategy, or is it operation? So very often it's really just semantics, right? So I kind of try to stay out of that. That said, for me, it's strategic if we're talking about the strategic questions. So if we're talking about the things that I just mentioned earlier, so depending on the level you're at, I want to discuss the respective questions. So if we are on a business level and we're talking about strategy here, I want to talk about, so what is the ambition? What are the challenges? Particular challenges about how do we create competitive advantage? So who is the core customer we want to focus on? What do we offer them? How are we going to do that? Why should they buy from us? And instead of going, so in other words, what is our competitive advantage? Why do they buy from us instead of from others? So that's for me the strategic questions. Right? Afterwards, whether then operationally it's okay, we have a process and we want to optimize that, or how are we going to do something in the details, that's for me then more the operational stuff.
Strategy is more around building the goals, the framework, the approach, the higher level thinking, and then tactics is down to the granularity, the sequence of tasks, and then getting to the assignees, the due dates, and all of that. I'm curious to see if you have, because you say they're more or less similar. I just wanted to see if that rings with you as well.
So what you just mentioned, I think that's also something important if we talk about strategy, and that is something that we do in the Better Strategy School. Actually, is we look at strategy from different perspectives. So you have different dimensions first. So you have the content of strategy, which is these layers. You have a process of strategy, and all of that happens in a strategy context. And then you have strategic thinking. Now, all of these dimensions, there are different perspectives. Like if we talk about strategic thinking, for example, two perspectives are, it can be more analytical and logical, or it can be more intuitive and creative. If we talk about business strategy, there are some who say, well, we need to start with looking at the customers. So it's more of an outside-in perspective. It's more market-driven. There are others who say, no, you need to look at your strengths, your capabilities, your resources, and then think about what can you do with that. So in other words, it's more inside out. It's more resources-driven. So these are different perspectives on how to look at these issues of strategy, if you like.
No, I love that.
That is something important. Something important to realize, and also something that you should be aware of. How do I actually think about strategy? And in fact, we are currently working on an AI strategy profiler, which will help you to kind of get clear about these
bringing up a
perspectives,
question.
right? Get clear about these perspectives. Now, so back to what you just said, Justin. You have a particular perspective to look at strategy and tactics, right? Another perspective could be, one that resonates well with me is from Peter Compo. So Peter wrote a nice book. It's called The Emergent Approach to Strategy. And he talks about strategy as it's the rules for the entire organization. Like, here is the customers we focus on, here is the products that we sell, and we don't do anything else, right? And tactics are also rules, but they apply to a more limited scope. So you could say, if we, a tactic is how do we go to market, for example. So we do only ads and we don't do social media. So that could be more of a tactical kind of decision. Right? So the point here is, I think there are different perspectives. Right? And again, I'm not dogmatic about this is the right way or the wrong way.
Sure.
Again, what is important is that in your company, in your team, in your department, in your function, you align on, if we say strategy, this is really what we mean, and if we say tactics, this is what we mean. I think that's the most important thing that's going to help you actually to,
I love that.
drive, make progress and drive and make
Yeah, I love
and
that.
create value.
I also love that you just said that you still define, because you said you consider like a go to market. How are you going to do that? That's a tactical decision, but you also define that as strategic as well, which it is, right? It just takes
Yeah,
us down like another layer because it gets us into
yeah.
how we're strategizing the actual like operational pieces. And it's so hard to say this stuff without saying the term names. But yeah, but you opened the door a second ago. We have one or two questions in here, but you opened the door a few seconds ago to AI. I wasn't going to bring it in, but since you mentioned it and we do have a question, I'm going to ask this one. So Srikan is asking, in the age of AI, basically, how is strategy changing at the organizational level?
So it's a question that you get very often in terms of when should we change the strategy, right? And the simple answer is if it's no longer working, or if something, going back to that idea of strategic challenges, whenever the circumstances change, uh, you need to think about, well, do we need to update our strategy based on what is happening or not, right? So that's one part of the answer. So if it no longer works, the circumstances change, you need to change your course of action, then it's time to review your strategy. And in fact, one of the things that I often do, and that's also something I think is very pragmatic and very relevant for project managers, is always ask about. So when I do a strategy review, I do four things. I ask about, are we doing what we said we're going to do? Is it leading to the results that we wanted to see? Are there any new insights we need to take into account? Did we learn anything that makes us need to review our strategy? And the fourth thing is always about, what is the mood in the team or the function, the organization about the strategy? Is everybody still convinced that this is the right way to go? If
Hang
not,
on, Mark.
and you have new insights or you're not seeing the results, then it's time to review your strategy.
So we've gone through the portfolio of evaluating priorities based off of the organizational direction, as well as any kind of metrics such as internal rate of return, payback period, as well as any kind of strategic positioning that can help the organization. That comes down to a program, and they build a roadmap, and it gets into aligning towards that portfolio and organizational strategy. Now we're at the project level. At the project level, you have a strategy component and you have a tactical component. When it comes to strategy, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, either of you, in the strategy piece, you build a roadmap for milestones. You determine what tools are going to be used for collaboration. You're going to also measure exit criteria, which include KPIs, and determining all of the different governance that goes into play if you're not part of a PMO, which are the guardrails that are around decision making, prioritization, and escalation paths. You also have the different ways that you're going to build reporting. So in other words, there are different layers of strategy. You've got the reporting mechanism, you've got the tool selection process, the timeline and the overview, and then the people component. Is that a fair summation of bringing that all down from an organizational enterprise level, from a functional level down to a project level?
So the way I think about it is, so you have your strategy, you decided on strategic initiatives, and then these go into projects. Right? Now, the first thing for me is always, I would try to minimize anything that is, how should I say? I would try to minimize the amount of projects actually, right? Or the amount of initiatives, because the organization is always going to see that there's something extra and something on top. Right? So the way I try to drive strategy forward is to bake it into the daily business of the teams and the departments and the functions, so that it is more, daily work and not seen as a project, which is something extra. Right? Now, obviously, that doesn't always work. Right? So obviously, if you have a reorganization, or you might introduce as part of your strategy, you say, well, we need new ways of working and we need new systems and tools. Right? then obviously that has a project approach to it. Right? Now, for all of these things, then we establish governance. So we have a selection of stakeholders, senior leaders who are part of the governance, where we do the reporting on how are the projects doing, how are we kind of using the four questions that I asked earlier, right? Are we doing what we said we do? So are we moving according to plan? Are we seeing results or not, right? So going beyond very often in my experience, project management is really about, or I've seen lots of organizations when they say we do project management, they focus on the task. Is it done? And they don't look at the results. They don't look at the outcome. So that's
Correct.
also in terms of, as a project manager, if you want to be more strategic, don't just manage the tasks, but look at, are we achieving the results that we wanted to achieve, right? To look at that, right? And then, yeah, I guess you have obviously on the project level, you have the stuff that you mentioned. So you have the tools to manage those. You have the resources that you need to assign, and you have the people who manage these projects.
So we have a question in the chat. I can't pull it up because it's not available for me to do so. But the question comes from Subo Casey. He says, how do you recommend bridging the gap between the person who delivers outcomes and becoming the person who defines the outcomes? And I think that's a product program thing, but I do want to let you go ahead and answer that for him.
Yeah, I think it's getting a seat at the table. I guess it's the question about how do you move up the career, and how do you kind of get involved in the strategic
Yeah.
discussion. Right?
I think it also has to do with the relationship that you have with the business units. So if you can build a strong relationship with your business stakeholders, project managers and program managers are able to connect the actual tasks, completing them, and they provide the feedback for the actual outcomes. It's unlikely that you're going to have that visibility towards how that translates towards the organizational outcomes or the business departmental outcomes as well. That's where that bridge comes in, because as project or program managers, we can't see that ourselves.
But you can be involved in the conversation, though. Right? I think that's
Correct.
that's the important part. So I've seen project managers who come and they just report, here are the lights, and here is what we've done, and here's the percentage points completion, whatever. Right? And we've all sat through these kind of reporting meetings, right? And usually people say, leaders especially say, this is pretty boring, right?
Mhm.
And I don't feel like you really kind of I don't feel like I'm adding value to this meeting, right? You're just reporting this to me. I could read it up and be done, right? So the value added comes the moment project managers, they raise the challenges. They talk about the challenges. Right? I know maybe we don't like doing that. Obviously, it's better if you have green lights that you can report on, right? But what executives actually want to be engaged in is the discussions about the product. So as a project manager, I think it's about sharing these observations that you have. And it might not, it's not about a KPI, but it's really about, why are we not moving forward, right? Why are we not seeing the results? Right? That's kind of the discussions you need to have. So you need to become more strategic in your discussions, the discussions that you initiate as a project manager also, which will then eventually help you to be involved in more of these strategic discussions. Right?
So go ahead. E.
Yeah, and I would say so, because this goes back to us tying, like, being advocates for the business, raising things. But I just wanted to stress something you said, because as you said, a lot of people don't, they wanted us to report on green, but that becomes boring because leaders want to know the problems. And to the people that we have on the call that are not as seasoned, who are more aspiring, right? I think it's important to raise that, while I understand when you are kind of brand new or a few years into being a project manager, you are kind of afraid to make things red, or make things yellow, or raise that. People don't like that. There's always those discussions. But ultimately, when you aren't transparent in that, when you don't raise that, it turns into something so much bigger. So it's not only better for the business to raise something early and act on it proactively, but it's also what leaders want to see, and when you do that, you are also they're starting to see you in a different light as well, because you are not afraid to talk to talk about the hard things, the tough things.
Correct.
That's what
And I
leaders
would
Yeah,
want to
so I think
do.
emphasize, go ahead, Mark.
it's about adding that value. And again, if you want to be more strategic in your thinking, then look at what are the challenges. What are the challenges now? Maybe you want to think 2, 3 steps ahead, challenges that might come, right? And think about how can you help the business, how can you help leaders solve these challenges, right? And then you being seen as somebody who really adds value to the business and to the conversation, right?
Okay. Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with the 2 steps ahead. And I just want to harp on something that Elizabeth said, which is projects, they're not going to always be green. And that is a reason why project managers exist, because we need to be able to course correct. And as a strategic thinker, you need to be able to figure out how to gather timely information and report it in a way that incites or facilitates decision making. So when it's yellow, you're already flagging risks. And this is a great segue, what I'll get into in a second. And then red is we're behind and we need to course correct. Now, this gets to bullet point 3, linking project risks and decisions to business impact. And I'm going to start with a question from Ayaz Ahmed, which is, how do you differentiate between the project that is off track and a strategy that's no longer valid?
So that goes back really to, for me, that goes back to this question of, are we doing what we said we're going to do, right? I mean, you don't know whether the strategy works or not if you're not really acting upon it, whether if you're not really implementing it or living it, right? And so the project is off track if you're not doing what you said you're going to do, right? If you do what you said you're going to do, but you're not achieving the results that you were hoping to see, then, well, you might need to look at your strategy. You need to think about, so what are we learning here? What is working? What is not working? Why is it not working? What are the new insights we're gathering? And how can we use that to update the strategy?
Well, Elizabeth, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but scope of a project tying to the organizational strategy is how we can differentiate between if it's on track or on track, plus if the leadership changes strategy. This is where if your scope is to improve a workflow so that it is fully automated and there is a gap in terms of some sort of mapping or a legacy process that wasn't considered, and that's not currently in scope, then we are off track. We're not going to get to a point where there's operational readiness and the scope needs to be modified in some way or a discussion needs to be had. It has to do exactly with what you said, Mark, which is around doing what we said, but that doing what we said isn't just at a sequence list of tasks, but the outcomes we're planning to achieve for why the project was initiated in the first place.
That's what I was going to say, was outcomes. I think it's okay if things go off track. It's okay if strategy changes, in my opinion, but you're still marching towards the same goal. So if that's part of what change and governance is in projects and programs, right? So the question is, are we still marching towards this goal? Sometimes you do, like if you're in a tech project, you need to change up your solutions, right? Or you said process isn't as efficient, right? So scope can change, schedule can change, budget can change. The question is, are we still on track to meet our goals, or is the goal changing? I think that's
Yeah.
the question you have to ask there in that term, because strategy, the path you choose to get to that goal can change over time, as long as you get
It
to the
goes
goal,
back to
the
what we
outcome.
said earlier, but it's another. How do you, what is your strategic, or what is your mindset? How do you think about strategy, right? So you can think
Right.
about strategy as planning. So we have a plan that we need to execute, right? Or you can think about strategy as learning. And many would argue that these days, as everything is so dynamic, it should be more about learning. So there's always something that is going to work, there's something that is not going to work, and then the question is, how can we adapt to that, right? And going back to what Elizabeth just said, so you have your ambition that you're working towards, right? But the strategy to get there might need to change, right? So that's where the learning comes into play. So it becomes more of an iterative kind of cycle of we design something, we execute it, we drive the project, but we learn from the projects also, and we need to kind of feed that back up so it goes into the strategy and it informs the strategy, right? And as you go through these different cycles, the maturity of your strategy actually goes up. I mean, if you want to be more strategic, then you need to think about the bigger picture. You need to know what problem are we actually solving with this project for the organization, and then make sure that you stay on solving the problem. Right? And very often, we might have a project and somebody decided that this is the way to go, but then halfway through you see that it's not really going to solve the problem, or there are other problems that come up. Then there is no
Right.
use, in my mind, to force the project, but you need to have that discussion around, well, is it really solving the problem? Should we change course or do something different? Or do we need to expand the scope, as you said earlier, to really drive towards what is the problem that we set out to solve with this project?
Right. That goes back to exactly what we just said before of the project can change, the strategy can change
Yeah.
as long as you're still trying to reach that. You still
Yeah,
have
and
the
that's
same
another
end
thing.
goal in
So
mind.
we talked earlier
Um,
about
uh,
prioritization. So there's another way to look
yeah.
at prioritization is, so we talked about prioritizing
Okay.
challenges. When discussing projects and discussing strategic moves or initiatives, I often ask, is it clear why we are doing that? So in other words, is it clear what problem we are actually solving? And is it really clear what we should be doing? So is the project actually clear? Is the scope clear? Is are the tasks clear? Is the approach clear or not? Right? And so you have a matrix, right? And there are cases where it's very clear why we should be doing it, what problem we should be solving, and how we should be doing it. So by all means, go and do this. Right? Then you might have stuff where the problem is clear, but it's not clear what the project should be or how you're going to solve it really. So that's an area where you need to do more experimentation, maybe with different kind of solutions. Right? Sometimes the problem is not clear, so obviously you don't know what you should be doing about it. So it's more about exploring and understanding the problem first before you initiate a project to solve it. Right? Or if you have the project already, you might need some time to better understand the problem as part of the project. And then there was a fourth category, which is a really interesting one, I think, is sometimes we do stuff we don't really know why. Right? So, and like very often I see it, a new leader comes into an organization. In the former organization, they had a certain IT system. Now they want to have it here too. But there is nothing wrong with the existing IT system in the organization. It's just out of habit or whatever. And so we initiate a project and it doesn't really solve a problem. And so
Political.
this is a bug, and I call it eliminate. So you could kind of get rid of these types of initiatives.
So I wanted to jump in on something you said a second ago. I always tell project and program managers, part of the way we can start advocating for the business and becoming strategic partners is understanding the why. You already kind of said that. We need to know why are we doing something, right? But you also sometimes you don't know how to solve that. So something I've seen in organizations, and I've done it myself, is one of the ways we can bring project managers in and program managers in is not just when you've got like a close product program or project relationship, but maybe you bring them into brainstorming sessions where it's like, here's what we're trying to solve, why we're trying to solve it, right? And then you get everyone to become strategic partners where you get in, you're doing brainstorming together, and then there's also a sense of ownership where if one of those ideas actually that we move forward with, and this happens a lot with more of experimentation stuff because they're a little bit smaller scale, right? But that's a good way in for project or program managers to come in and get more strategic, right? Because they get to take part in the what, right? And then since they kind of owned it, they have a better opportunity to take not just the ownership of the idea, but now take ownership of the initiative.
Yeah, I'm a
Have
big
you seen
fan
that
of
work as well,
involving
Mark?
the organization in the strategy and making it happen. Now, there are different ways of how you can do that. So more from a leadership perspective, but I also have to say that some leaders, they are more open to that, and others are not. Right? Right. And that's not the way it is. But I'm a
Yeah.
firm believer in open strategy, and open in the sense of opening it up and involving more people in the process. So the least I would always do is, even if leadership says, well, on the strategic level, we're going to decide and we're not going to involve too many people. Once we have, so as part of the strategy, we define strategic moves. I call them moves or strategic initiatives, right? And when we do that on the strategy level,
Mhm.
it can be something very high level in the sense of, well, we need to reorganize, and we need to still define what that organization looks like. And then we have a project, an initiative where we involve more people to doing that. Or we need to reinvent the customer journey. Right? So that then becomes the project where I try to involve as many relevant stakeholders as possible.
I, I also want to jump in on one more thing you said. Because this is something everyone faces in every company. I think it was the last piece you said, the part 4. Sometimes someone comes in, you've got a new person, he's a new IT leader, you gave it as an example, and he just wants to do a project just because. Now, you being someone who's the advocate for strategy, do you have any recommendations for how that can be handled? Because really, it's a political complexity, right? It's navigating that culture. Is there any recommendation there that where people from the project program, or even if we have just product managers coming in, how you can kind of manage that from the functional level, even though it's more of like that corporate or
Yeah,
business
as you
decision?
said, it can be a very political kind of thing, right? So you need to be conscious of the context, and obviously it depends. If you're a very junior person, there's nothing you can do about it, probably, right? Apart, maybe if you have a very good relationship with your boss, you can kind of take it to him or her, and have a discussion around it, right? But I would just, so I mean, what you can always do is, in terms of wanting to be more strategic and wanting to be more of a business partner, to ask about, okay, what is really the problem we're trying to solve here, right? So that I can make a better job with executing it and make sure that we actually achieve uh, the objective. So at least have that kind of conversation, create the awareness. Maybe there is not really a problem that we're solving. Right?
So I want to close this out with this right initiatives and challenges bullet. I got this question for one of our attendees, Ruchi, who wasn't able to attend, which is, we've talked about prioritization for challenges, portfolios of projects, all of these different elements. What are signals of noise? Or in other words, what do you find that are noise pieces that we need to root out that affect our ability to prioritize effectively?
So going back to what I just said, is really, so noise is if it doesn't solve a challenge, right? So
Yeah,
if it's not really
politics.
clear what the challenge is, so that's for me the biggest noise in that sense, right? And then the other one that we had before is, so if it's not, if it's not mission critical and it's only relevant to a small part of the organization, that's also for me not a strategic thing, right? So that's also more noise. So if I don't know. HR says we need a new software package to manage
Yeah.
our training attendees. We've been doing it on Excel for the past 6 years. Then I would probably say, yeah, it's not really a priority. You could probably do another 6 months with doing it on Excel. Right? So that's the kind of, so I mean, that's these kind of ways of how I try to look at it and help to solve actually that what is noise versus what is really strategically relevant and crucial.
Okay. No, that's perfect. Would you take us to the final section, which is around career and strategic visibility that tie it all together with strategy?
Sure. He's been putting me on the spot all day today, guys. So I feel like this is so, Mark, my big thing to become strategically visible, to elevate your career, to grow, and you have to become a strategic partner. There are a lot of different things I say that you should do. One is always tie things to the business. You set it up as what is business survival, which is a better way to put it, right? When we say business impact, it's basically how do we tie our work to business survival? How do we get in a room with people? Part of that is building relationships across the organization. So we're setting ourselves up to be in front of people, be thought leaders, or drive decisions forward and drive strategy forward by demonstrating the trade-offs, not just listing the green, saying something's green, but not being afraid to stand up and say the hard decisions, push that forward, tie it to the business revenue. Is there anything else that you would recommend for a project manager to become more strategically visible besides just that business advocacy and
So
being
the
in the right
question is,
room
how do
with
you
the
get
right
into
people
the
and
right room,
speaking up?
right? And I think going back to what Justin just said, a lot of times, the question you can ask yourself is, how do you add value not only to the business, but how do you add value to the leader you're working with or for? And how do you add value, in my perspective, is by helping them to eliminate the noise and helping them to make sense of what is going on and make sense of all that complexity. So that is how you become more valuable and how you think more strategically from a leadership perspective. I would say. Right? So add value to the leaders you're working with. Not so you have the business value that you just mentioned, Elizabeth, but it's also about helping the leaders by cutting through the noise, by reducing the complexity, by helping them think more strategically in that sense. Right?
Yeah, and solve problems. That's something I always also say is when people want to get in the room or start like spreading their wings, it's what problem can I solve for you, right? How do I help you? Even if it means you're taking on more work, because that reduces the noise for those people and makes you more of a partner in their eyes. Marc, tell me, where can people find you? We're starting to get to a close. You've about 2 minutes left here. So where
You
can
can
people
find me
find
on
you?
LinkedIn. So if you want to connect there, that's a good place. And then all the work at the moment, you'll find everything on makebetterstrategy.com. So it's an online business school for strategy, we call it. So there is a lot of free stuff that you can actually download there. There's a guest account, so you get some free training on. And then obviously there is upgrade options if you want to go deeper into strategy. And there we share everything we talked about. So also these prioritization matrices that I talked about, all of that stuff you get it at makebetterstrategy.com. And Elizabeth, I just saw that you posted a webinar. So we have a webinar on November 27. I know it's Thanksgiving in the US, but maybe we have some audiences who are not from the US and don't have anything to do on that day, right? So in that webinar, it's a masterclass which is done by my co-founder of the business school and me, Professor Bob DeWitt. So Bob has written one of the most used textbooks on strategy in the world. It's used in like 75 countries around the world, and so hundreds of business schools and universities. And there we're going to talk more about these perspectives that I mentioned earlier and how you think about strategy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you guys, everyone. We have one more session before the holiday season. I put that link in the chat as well. We're going back to the basics of literally everything a project manager needs to know, from going from execution to strategic. It's another Marc, so I guess we're closing it off with the Marcs before the holiday season. But thank you so much for letting us into your homes and your offices for the last hour. Marc, thank you so much for joining. We've put all of your information in here, and we'll go ahead and share that out again, and we'll get to all of the questions in the comments as well. So until then, we will see you guys next week for our next session. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.